Part 3. Saturn in Transit. The Case of Ficino. Starting in the late 12th century, the Latin West began to see new developments in theories of theology, astral magic, that is, nigromancia, and natural philosophy, which gradually coalesced into the idea that although individuals were certainly influenced by celestial bodies, with the help of specific kinds of practical magic passed down by such beloved ancient sages as Aristotle, they could manipulate the boundaries of their respective destinies. Naturally, one of the foremost arenas for the expression of this idea was in the field of human health. Not long after the 12th century introduction of Arabic image magic into the Latin West, Christian theologians were quick to react against it with the argument that simple prayers and good works could act just as well, if not better, as effective substitutes for such potentially dangerous magical operations as those offered up in a text like the wildly popular pseudo-Aristotelian Secretum Secretorum, the Sir al-Asrar. The Franciscan Roger Bacon, for example, who'd publish his own edition of that partly astromagical text, in no way denied that the arrangement of the heavenly bodies conditioned the world below. Nevertheless, he believed that through the power of simple pieties, quote, even a poor little old woman by her prayers and merits, if supported by the benevolence of God, can change the order of nature. End quote. Prayers were addressed straight to the Creator in his supercelestial domain, and thus thought to bypass any of the intermediary mechanisms of fate, rendering all prayers and offerings to intercessory beings in the celestial world frivolous, or at worst, blasphemous. These sensibilities could be said to have begun in late antiquity with the Church Fathers' disparaging writings about the Hermetic Asclepius, and merely to have come to a head in the university debates of the 13th century, subsequently setting the haunting tone for all later debates about the nature of planetary influences in Europe's places of power. Once the scholastics had effectively stripped the science of nigromancia from all its ostensibly demonic characteristics, what was left behind was essentially magia naturalis, natural magic, an innocuous and inoffensive pursuit, that is, experimentation with the healing properties of plants or stones, or research into the iron-attracting powers of the lodestone, the study of which has often been touted as one of the chief tributaries feeding into the scientific revolution. Apart from his role as translator and court philosopher, Ficino became a major figure in his narrative as a practitioner of both magic and medicine. There's no doubt that Ficino read the Secretum Secretorum, Al-Kindi, Al-Qurtubi, and Abu Mashar in Latin translations. While his use of Al-Kindi and Abu Mashar is self-evident from his De Vita, especially since he uses formulations like Abu Mashar and some others say when citing his authorities, his selective use of Picatrix is confirmed by a letter that he dictated to Michele Acciari to be sent to Filippo Valori. In it, he discussed his cautious borrowings of Picatrix material in the composition of his De Vita. In response to Valori's request to borrow his copy of the book, Ficino explained that there's no use in reading it since everything of value in it had been transferred to his De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, the third installment of the self-help series he was writing in 1489 for his melancholic patron, Lorenzo de' Medici. If you read it diligently, says the letter, you will be left wanting nothing from that Picatrix. As one among a handful of definitive examples demonstrating his use, we can also see Ficino drew from Picatrix 2, 10, 14, and 41 his instructions on how to craft a sapphire or Feirizek ring for life extension using an image of Saturn in his hour while he's ascending and fortunately placed. Ficino justified his own use of these kinds of magical objects with the kinds of arguments one could find being made as early as the Speculum Astronomiae, a work he himself attributed, albeit incorrectly, to Albertus Magnus in response to the 1277 condemnations of Averroan and Aristotelian philosophy at the University of Paris, and the rising anxieties over texts like the Secretum Secretorum. So long as he avoided the addressative magic which involves conjuring spirits, he felt he was merely manipulating impersonal forces of nature by using tools like astrological talismans and lifestyle changes, not making compacts with demons. In light of these recommendations, he put the following disclaimer in the introduction to the third book. The whole of my book forms an epitome of medicine which will assist your life as much as possible that it may be both healthy and long. And it employs at every point the resources of doctors aided by the heavens. This shop of ours displays various antidotes, drugs, fomentations, ointments, and remedies according to the differing mental capacities and natures of men. If in some way they happen to displease you, pass over these by all means, but do not for that reason repudiate the rest. Finally, if you do not approve of the astronomical images, albeit invented for the health of mortals, which even I do not so much approve of as I report, dismiss them with my complete permission, and even, if you will, by my advice. To deal more clearly with this complication in the face of scrutiny after the publication of his De Vita, Ficino wrote an apology which broke down magic into two categories: the demonic, which he called inquisitive, and the natural, which he called necessary. The latter he claimed to practice exclusively, purely as a means to achieving optimal health, while the former he claimed to reject wholeheartedly, in spite of the numerous operations he conveyed in De Vita unambiguously enacted for manipulating spirits. Throughout the De Vita, however, Ficino exhibited the nervous tendency to hide behind his authorities, the, quote, Arabs and the, quote, Platonists, whenever recommending suspect procedures, particularly talismanic operations, and therefore he only recommended to his readers the operations he deemed salubrious and in line with established Christian principles and the conceptual guidelines of Magia Naturalis as set down in the scholastic polemics from the Middle Ages. Although our melancholic priest began his De Vita Coelitus Comparanda as a commentary on Plotinus, specifically Aeneid's 4:3-11, this pretense was quickly dropped as the work expanded far beyond this initial scope, and admittedly Plotinus himself had never been interested in practical magic, talismans, or writing medical advice for princes. As such, if he was really drawing upon Chaldeans, Egyptians, and Platonists to give theoretical support to his image of a perfect sage, he did so from Iamblichus's De Mysteriis Aegyptiorum, Synesius's De Somniis, Proclus's De Sacrificio et Magia, and Michael Psellos's De Daemonibus. Despite all of these sources, and although hesitant to admit it, it wasn't chiefly from these figures, but from the Astrologi Arabes, especially the Secretum Secretorum, Al-Kindi, Abu Mashar, and Al-Qurtubi, or Picatrix, that Ficino drew the specifics for his ideas on how to achieve his perfect nature. Perfect nature is an important concept that sits at the heart of Picatrix, and it constitutes a kind of spiritual illumination experienced by the perfected sage at the summit of all learning in both the sciences and in philosophy. It was thought to comprise the fulfillment of one's inborn telos or purpose, and this could be accomplished solely by living in accordance with one's personal astrological allotment, as defined by the conditions in one's natal chart. In Picatrix, perfect nature manifests itself as a kind of knowledge and conversation with one's higher genius, which could be invoked through the fulfillment of certain ritual conditions, and this is described in Picatrix 3:6. Without explicitly naming this teleological concept in his own work, Ficino appropriated the idea of the self which strove to rise above the ebbs and flows of cosmic forces through the marriage of scientific and philosophical pursuits. What Ficino did differently, however, was to reinterpret his quest for the fulfillment of human entelechy, that is, the realization of one's potential, as a medico-physiological process rather than one which was necessarily brought about by the invocation of spirits. The Picatrix itself belongs to a pseudo-Aristotelian causal and semiotic tradition in the vein of such ray-oriented astrological systems as Al-Kindi and his student Abu Mashar, and later the Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan al-Safa, all of whom were steeped in such literature as the talismanic pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, and all of whose views on practical magic were also framed by the translations into Arabic of such works as The Theology of Aristotle, a paraphrased version of Porphyry's rendition of Plotinus's Aeneids 4-6, and The Book of the Pure Good, a paraphrase of Proclus's Elements of Theology, also known later as the Liber de Causis in Europe. The Picatrix might be said to be Neoplatonic insofar as its astrology and talismans were thought to operate within a Neoplatonic cosmological system consisting of hypostatic divisions emanating outward from the One, but this is merely one of its many constituent influences, and to call it purely Neoplatonic would be to efface the diversity of its sources: Hermetic, Peripatetic, Galenic, Jabirian, Pseudo-Empedoclean, etc. If we are to understand Ficino's wariness in dealing with a book like Picatrix, we must keep in mind how ideas about Saturn and the operations pertaining to him, alongside those dealing with any other planets, were transplanted from a Hellenistic and Hermetic context into a late medieval Christian one with strong eschatological, anti-Islamic, and anti-demonic sensibilities. These rituals, operations, and ingredients in Ficino's sources were professed to acquire their power from existing within a natural philosophical system that implied the hidden actions of spiritual, volitionally charged beings with whom it was long forbidden to associate. Nonetheless, in order to remain free from the strains of demonology, Ficino reconceptualized and passed on much of the Picatrix's magic as effectively naturalistic and medicinal, meaning all of the associated idolatrous baggage was unnecessary and could be left out. It is by this reconceptualization that we can see Ficino, according to the teachings of pseudo-Aristotle's Problemata, call his own Saturnine nature a unique and divine gift, in a letter to his friend Giovanni Cavalcanti. As a philosopher, priest, and melancholic individual, Ficino understood himself to be a veritable child of Saturn, but this to him wasn't necessarily a negative lot as it would have seemed to many other astrologers of his day. He would use the metaphor of hidden gold in referring to the gift that this astral configuration signified to those who were specifically on a philosophical path, that is, the path leading to the goal of the sage. the fulfillment of their natures through a complete knowledge and understanding of creation's inner workings. Ficino's sun sign was in Scorpio, ruled by Mars, but more importantly for the astrology of the period, his ascendant, that is, what lay on the eastern horizon at the time of his birth, was comprised of Saturn in Aquarius, which is the house of Saturn's joy. Perhaps the most detailed passage Ficino wrote about Saturn is the following. You certainly should not neglect the power of Saturn, for the Arabic writers, that is, Picatrix, say he is the most powerful of all. That we know planets submit their powers to those planets whom they are approaching, but that all approach him, rather than vice versa, because he is the slowest, and that planets in conjunction with him act according to his nature. For he is of all planets the head of the widest sphere. Saturn is also neighbor of the innumerable fixed stars, and indeed he's very similar to the primum mobile because he travels a lengthy circuit. He is the highest of the planets, hence they call that man fortunate whom Saturn fortunately favors. And although most people are terrified of him as alien from the ordinary life of man, nevertheless the Arabs consider he is agreeable even to the common life whenever he has very great power and dignity as he ascends, or his Jupiter, his temperer, aspects him favorably, or receives him well in his terms. Otherwise, unseasonably received in matter, particularly gross matter, his influence is like a poison, just as by putrefaction or adustion an egg may become poisonous. From such influence, certain people are born or become impure, lazy, sad, envious, and exposed to impure demons. Flee far from the company of these, for in other places the poison of Saturn lies hidden and dormant, like sulfur far from flame. But in living bodies it often blazes up, and like kindled sulfur, not only burns, but fills everything around with noxious vapor and infects the bystanders. Against this influence of his, generally alien to and in a way unsuitable for human beings, Jupiter arms us by means of the following. With his natural quality, with certain foods and medicines of his, with images, as they think, and with behavior, business dealings, studies, and affairs properly pertaining to himself. But it is not only those who flee to Jupiter who escape the noxious influence of Saturn and undergo his propitious influence. It is also those who give themselves over with their whole mind to divine contemplation, signified by Saturn himself. Here among the host of sources Ficino employed, we see him trusting in Picatrix, hidden behind the simple label of Arabes, in renegotiating the consequences of being born beneath the malefic influence of Saturn, especially as it pertained to being endowed by nature with a cold and dry, melancholic complexion. Saturn, being the loftiest, most spiritually rarefied of the planets, occupied a liminal position between the celestial and the supercelestial, between the intelligible and the unintelligible, between what can be understood through the senses and what is only accessible through divine contemplation. Ficino put his faith in the notion held by the Arabic writers that on the very account of Saturn's loftiness, they call that man fortunate whom Saturn fortunately favors. In the same breath, he claims that on the one hand, a Saturnine influence at one's birth is like living with a potential poison within one's body, but on the other, he rests assured that since the Arabs consider Saturn agreeable as he ascends, or if he is well tempered by Jupiter. Here then, we can see from where our Florentine physician established the foundation of his ideas on how to combat melancholy. In this way, Although Saturn ascending in Aquarius still signified ill health when Ficino looked at his birth chart, the positive side was that decrepitude or crippling depression would also force him into desk-bound contemplation, forcing him to rise up and out of his body toward the immutable realm of perfect ideas in the study of philosophy. A life devoted to the study of divine truths was most natural for a person of a Saturnine disposition, and to act in accordance with one's nature was simply the optimal way to live. Ficino tells us in concluding chapter 22 of his De Vita Coelitus Comparanda, entitled 7 Ways in which we can accommodate ourselves to celestial things, which is his section devoted to the various types of people for whom Saturn is either malign or propitious, whom Jupiter defends from Saturn, and, most importantly, how the heavens act on the spirit, the body, and the soul. There Ficino writes, "Just as the sun is hostile to nocturnal animals, Saturn is hostile to those people who are either leading publicly an ordinary life, or even to those fleeing the company of the crowd, but not laying aside their ordinary emotions." To Ficino, perfecting one's nature, as it is in the Picatrix or in the Secretum Secretorum, was to be achieved by working along with the conditions of one's astrological allotment, rather than giving into despair on account of one's ill-fated natal chart marred by malefic aspects. The mechanism by which this perfection could be accomplished was through balancing one's humoral complexion. One of the ways of achieving this balance was naturally by modifying one's diet, lifestyle, and exercise regimen, and the other was astromagically, with talismanic images, sacrificial invocations, or through similar means of drawing upon the planetary powers one can find in the Picatrix. Though there are numerous operations relating to the powers of Saturn therein which might be thought of as purely medicinal, there are also many of them which fall under the category of addressative or inquisitive magic, and it is these operations which were for the most part responsible for the Picatrix's nefarious reputation. These were expressly avoided by Ficino, but the descriptions of Saturn's character and the things of this world which he governed, those remained useful in matters pertaining to medicine and altering one's complexion and physiology. Fully conscious of Saturn's dangerous, albeit ambivalent character, Ficino made it clear in De Vita that Saturn cannot easily signify the common quality and lot of the human race, which is solar, but he signifies an individual set apart from the others, divine or brutish, blessed or bowed down with the extreme of misery. To understand this elevation of Saturn through his application of astromagical principles, we need to revisit briefly the question of semiology and causation in the context of the Neoplatonic, Peripatetic, and Hermetic sources at his disposal. Debates as to whether stars were signs or causes ranged back to the Hellenistic period and were not new. Though the concepts of signs and causes cannot necessarily be said to be mutually exclusive in the pre-modern mind, Ficino had begun his project struggling to see the things of this world more in line with his favorite ancient sage, Plotinus, which is, for example, why he held the science of planetary aspects as chiefly metaphora. Plotinus's own perspective had differed from the claims of the more stoically minded astrological determinists of his own day. That is, he saw the things of this world as signified but not caused by the conjunctions of heavenly bodies. Nevertheless, this perspective, as juxtaposed with the perspective contained in Picatrix, such as in Picatrix 131, where the rays are both vectors of spirit and of elementary heat, forced Ficino to complexify his thinking. Had Ficino been operating purely on Neoplatonic foundations in his conception of the cosmos, he would have ignored the idea of planetary rays altogether and stood with Plotinus in the belief that the stars are strictly signs and not causes. To get around this idea, which was problematic for the degree to which Ficino's system was physical and medical, he employed the idea of a spiritus, a kind of malleable semi-substance animated by the soul, so as to retain the idea that stellar influences acted upon the medium of spirit before acting on the body, thus avoiding a rigidly mechanistic system without room for the exercise of free will. The nature of this spiritus, hot and moist, he associated chiefly with Jupiter and the Sun, claiming that, quote, "A healthy spirit does not have much in common with Saturn, Mars, or the Moon. Otherwise, it would be foolish as a result of the first, mad from the second, and insensitive from the last." In line with this, lunar beings, being too heavy and moist, are very foreign to the subtle and volatile nature of the spirit. Things which are very Saturnine and too martial are like poisons, naturally hostile to the spirit. When, therefore, the case demands that you help some one of the three spirits, the poor client will be difficult to help at a time when its patron, the planet ruling in his or her nativity, is unfortunate or debilitated. End quote. If the celestial world caused an actor with free will to do anything, then Ficino believed that it first had to go through the medium of spiritus before affecting the body. This idea came not from Plotinus, but from passages like Picatrix 4.1.1. Ficino took therefrom the notion that the celestial souls or planets impress themselves chiefly on human souls through the transmission of their spirits by means of rays. Such rays, emanating from the universal circle of spirit, cascaded through the heavens down into the spirit of the individual human. He explained the mechanism as such, quote, "Whenever we say celestial goods descend to us, understand, 1. that gifts from the celestial bodies come into our bodies through our rightly prepared spirit. 2. That even before that, through their rays, the same gifts flow into a spirit exposed to them either naturally or by whatever means. And 3. That the goods of the celestial souls partly leap forth into this our spirit through rays, and from there overflow into our souls, and partly come straight from their souls, or from angels, into human souls which have been exposed to them. Exposed, I say, not so much from some natural means as by the election of free will or by affection." End quote. In this more humorally oriented and psychologically restricted approach to astral influences, Ficino could uphold both his sense of orthodoxy and his learning in astral magic. With a modified or Christian-friendly version of the causal and semiotic perspective from Picatrix, Ficino could interpret contemporary astrological theory with an emphasis on the mediating role of the spirit, man's predisposition to it, and the freedom of the will, all while maintaining the existence of celestial and supercelestial intelligences. In accordance with the teachings of Alcindes de Radiis, the Secretum Secretorum, and Picatrix, however, Ficino believed that if the human spirit was properly disposed through the consumption or avoidance of specific natural things, then it would more easily receive the influence of specific celestial souls. Since Ficino believed that he felt Saturn's influence by the election of free will, or by affection, through the medium of spirit, he gave himself good incentive to perceive Saturn as not all malefics and misfortunes in the way which he had been popularly perceived through the systems of essential dignities and debilities stretching back to Alexandrian astrology. In line with the teachings of Picatrix, Ficino chose to perceive Saturn more explicitly as the noblest star, as that which is furthest from the earth and therefore closest to God, who is immutable and transcendent. This choice he enacted by tempering Saturn's hostile nature rather than by beseeching him directly. By means of various techniques that mitigated Saturn's spiritually poisonous effects, Ficino disposed himself to Saturn's more edifying qualities. This lofty and noble Saturn, now medically placated as it were, thus became an ambivalent rather than a malefic star. If Saturn was unfortunate to a given individual, Ficino would have argued that it was because that individual refused to exercise their free will and learn how to align, condition, and prepare their spirits against his malignant effects. In the maintenance of optimal health, therefore, Ficino advised melancholics, himself included among them, to counterbalance their Saturnine natures with jovial and venereal qualities, whether through conscious exposure to the rays of Jupiter and Venus, or through the use of talismanic images, music, and medicine made from substances that impress similar effects upon the soul through the influx of the planet's spiritual rays. He did not, for example, advise his clients to reenact the rituals of Al-Tabari, but he did make use of the many lists cataloging what kind of things pertain to what planets, which could then be employed in tempering all kinds of undesirable planetary influences. In dealing with this issue, Ficino denied that the malefic planets were intrinsically harmful by necessity, holding instead to the notion that the dose makes the poison. Quote, "If anyone wishes to convict Saturn and Mars of being harmful by nature, which I never would believe, still they are to be used just as doctors sometimes use poisons." Ptolemy endorses this in his Centiloquium, which is one of the Picatrix's many sources. The force of Saturn, therefore, cautiously taken, will sometimes profit, just as doctors say those things do which are astringent and constrictive, even those things which stupefy, as opium and mandrake. The Magi, Brahmins, and Pythagoreans seem to have been most prudent in this, in that when they feared that Saturn would oppress them on account of their sedulous zeal for philosophizing, they'd wear white clothes, use jovial or Theban sounds and songs every day, and live continuously in open air. Here, drugs and medicinal plants become Ficino's chief metaphor for understanding planetary influences, and the very effects of Saturn were thought to work analogously to those stupefying plants which that planet so appropriately governed. Again, Ficino wasn't merely making up the advice he gave. Rather, his advice was variously rooted in the authority of ancient sages, men of renown and athletes of asceticism whom our humanist philosopher revered and who were all included in that carefully collected compendium made up of over 224 sources called Picatrix. These included operations of such renowned sages as Ptolemy, Jabir ibn Hayyan, Ibn Washia, Plato, Aristotle, and Hermes Trismegistus, and their perceived antiquity significantly reinforced Ficino's confidence as to their veracity and effectiveness. In De Vita, Ficino set himself to the task of explaining why it is that men like Magi, Brahmins, and Pythagoreans, namely scholars, always find themselves suffering from their sedulous zeal for philosophizing. He concluded that cogitation, long wakefulness, and worry create an excessive dryness in the human body, which thereby exacerbates a cold and dry or melancholic complexion. This humoral complexion produced various effects in the human spirit, which then predisposed the body and soul to receive effects that were associated with Saturn's power. Although Ficino provided a natural pathology for the scholar's suffering and looked to treat symptoms with natural remedies, his list of things for patients to consume or avoid correspond with the list of things that correspond with planetary influences in Picatrix or Abu Mashar. Ficino's anti-melancholy therapies were made up of things traditionally signified by those planets which countered Saturn's malefic influences, like the use of gold, lyre music, walks through the garden, leisure, and the company of agreeable people, that is, jovial and venereal things. Such cures were passed on by Ficino as non-magical medicinal information, as the wisdom of ancient sages. But his sources in this regard were discreetly astromagical, based on ideas from a science of aspects which he largely disbelieved, and a system of demonic conjuration he found abhorrent, but which he felt produced positive effects regardless. These weren't the teachings of Alexandrian Neoplatonists. In writing about how to avoid that most awful kind of black bile, Ficino suggested avoiding the following Saturnine things. Quote, heavy and thick wine, especially if it is dark. Food which is hard, dry, salted, bitter, sharp, stale, burnt, roasted, or fried. Beef and the meat of a hare, old cheese, foods pickled in brine, vegetables, especially the broad bean, the lentil, the eggplant, the colewort, cabbage, mustard, the radish, the garlic, the onion, the leek, the black medic, and carrots, and whatever causes warmth or cold, and likewise dryness, and everything that's black. Anger, fear, pity, sorrow, idleness, solitude, and whatever offends the sight, smell, and hearing, and most of all, darkness. Moreover, excessive dryness of the body increases black bile, whether it be the result of long wakefulness or much agitation of the mind or worry, or frequent sexual intercourse, and the use of things which are very hot and dry, or the result of any immoderate flux and purgation, or strenuous exercise, or fasting, or thirst, or heat, or a too dry wind, or cold. Since indeed black bile is always very dry and also cold, although not equally so, it must certainly be resisted with things which are moderately hot, but as moist as possible, and with foods that have been thoroughly boiled, since they are easily digested and produce blood which is subtle and very clear. End quote. By tempering the body through the avoidance of these things, one tempered the spirit, making it hot and moist as it ought to be, and thereby counteracting the negative effects of a Saturnine disposition, which is cold and dry. Here Ficino the physician, who plundered books of magic to find cures for his Saturnine Medici patron, further softened the image of Saturn as a pitiless source of misfortune. He showed, through these sanitized techniques he appropriated from astral magic, how that dark star's negative effects could naturally and willfully be mitigated, leaving behind only the positive ones. He didn't make sacrifices and invocations to Saturn in order to acquire these effects. Instead, he simply avoided those things which conditioned the spiritus to receive more Saturnine influence, and countered natural predispositions with anti-Saturnine activities, foods, jewelry, and other materia medica. through this distinctly non-addressative medical or therapeutic approach to manipulating astral influences, Ficino softened the image of Saturn as a malefic spirit or stellar daimon, whose veneration the schoolmen had been decrying since the 13th century in their repudiations of the Secretum Secretorum. Ficino's idiosyncratic synthesis of contemporary medicine, Christian theology, Neoplatonic philosophy, and Hermetic astral magic further sublimated Saturn not only by re-emphasizing his ambivalent nature, but by paving a way for intellectuals to think about Saturn as signifying natural phenomena which caused harm and disease, like darkness, miasma, bogs, and insects, without causing them directly through unimpeded demonic or supernatural influence. What's important to keep in mind is that Ficino, being inspired by, but also going beyond the Arabs and Platonists that he read, saw Saturn as a figure who, unlike any other planet, was a Janus-faced lord of dualism and a governor of extremes, of great riches and great poverty, of thriving crops and ruin, of safety and of restraint. Through this inherited feature, an individual held under the sway of Saturn's dominion could create for himself a significant amount of flexibility within their own fated allotment, which could form the basis for a whole new picture of how the cosmos operates. Klebansky, Panofsky, and Saxel, therefore, were very much correct to note that in regards to Saturn, quote, the birth of this new humanist awareness took place in an atmosphere of internal contradiction. Conclusion. Throughout this talk, we've looked at a number of associations attributed to Saturn in texts spanning from Greco-Roman antiquity to Ficino. We saw how, although many of these associations had their roots in the polytheistic imagery of antiquity, the very concept of what a planet is and how it operates underwent dramatic change throughout the Middle Ages as such ideas coalesced and transformed. We saw how this ancient divinity, with all his attendant mythology, part chthonic and part celestial, was from a rather early time demoted from his lofty place as an ambivalent god to a largely malefic force of nature by the deterministically minded among the Hellenistic astrologers, who needed purely unfortunate planets to make their mathematical point-based system of aspects operational. After this, we saw how this largely malefic, unfortunate, or negative image of Saturn was gradually restored to a state of ambivalence through a synthesis of the Platonists and the Arab astrologers envisioned by Marsilio Ficino. Though Ficino styled himself more so as an Orthodox Catholic philosopher, priest, and physician when dabbling in magical matters, the authors from which he read were more steeped in the inquisitive or addressative practices of the pagan world. Most of these practices Ficino considered transgressive, and so he borrowed ideas cautiously, adopting only what he believed salubrious and in keeping with his ideas about natural philosophy and medicine. We looked at some of the prayers, suffumigations, and sacrifices pertaining to Saturn's spirits as laid out explicitly in the Picatrix. From among these, we distinguished two kinds of operations, one which could be adapted to become acceptable to Christian intellectual circles, namely the therapeutic kind, and one which was considered abominable, the kind which made recourse to spirits in order to manipulate the forces of generation and corruption, and thereby enact various unfulfilled material desires. The former kind Ficino passed along with pride. The latter kind he passed over in silence, or at least drew from them what he thought valuable, namely the correspondences, and excluded the rest. Although divorced from the pagan context in which he originated, this return of an ambivalent Saturn played a lofty role in the Ficinian cosmology.